The proceeding will start shortly. The proceeding will start shortly. The proceeding will start.
First of all, can I welcome on behalf of the committee Bertie Ahern, the Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland from 1997 to 2008. Mr Ahern, we are extremely grateful to you for travelling from Dublin to give evidence to us today. The implications of Brexit for the border, for Ireland, have been absolutely central to the work of this committee since the result of the referendum, and as one of the principal architects of the Good Friday Agreement, you have a unique insight into the consequences of that decision, and we are extremely grateful to you for coming today. I would like to stress, both for the committee and for the benefit of those who are watching these proceedings, that you are giving evidence to us today entirely in a private capacity, and you are not speaking, obviously, on behalf of or representing the views of the Irish government. With that, you are very welcome, and I understand you'd just like to say a few words by way of beginning, and then we'll get into questions. I think almost every member of the committee has questions to put to you, and we are going to have to finish bang on 11:30 because you have other commitments to go to. So brevity in questions and answers would help. Mr Ahern.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and again thank you for inviting me, and thank the committee members. I think this is clearly a critical times in terms of managing the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union, and because of that, for the work of this committee, and I'm glad to be hopefully of assistance to you on that. Before I take questions, it may be useful for me to begin by just setting out just a few points and to outline very briefly my perspective on some of the issues that have been at the centre of the debate. At the start, and you've said for the record, I'm not speaking today on behalf of the Irish Government. I think I have been asked here today because there is an interest among your members in understanding as much as possible the impact that Brexit may have on the achievements of the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process, and I welcome that very much. I believe that the peace process in Northern Ireland is a tremendous shared achievement in which we can all take great pride. It transformed the situation in Northern Ireland, ending a cycle of tragic and intense conflict and allowing a new generation to grow out of the shadow of violence. It is never meant to be the end of reconciliation. It was meant to be the foundation for a closer and better relationship between Northern Ireland, between North and South, and the island of Ireland, and between Britain and Ireland. And the enormous pent-up desire for that foundation for the future was reflected in the popular votes in the referendum. Young people today, Chairman, in university and are getting their first job were born when the ceasefires were declared or the agreement was signed, but they have grown up in a better, safer place because of that. But it all remains a fragile process, and it's hugely important that we keep it moving forward. And for those three relationships, it was designed to improve and keep getting better. And if someone asks me, well, what's that got to do with Brexit? It's got everything to do with it. And we could see right away the moment the idea for the Brexit referendum was proposed that this would have huge implications for the island of Ireland. When we were negotiating the Good Friday Agreement, the fact that both of us were members of the European Union and that it was always going to be that way was taken as an absolute given and was a key assumption on which the agreement was based. The combined effect of the Good Friday Agreement and our common EU membership was that it became possible to remove the customs posts and the security towers and leave them permanently behind us. And the open and visible border we have today is an achievement of the process and our shared membership of the European Union. No one wants to see a hardening of that border, and anyone familiar with life in Northern Ireland and the border counties would see the prospects of any infrastructure or checks or controls along the border, all 300 miles of it, with more than 200 crossings, would react with enormous concern, and in my view, they'd be right. From our point of view, I think we want to keep the border just the way it is now, and I think that is a view of the entire island of Ireland. We want to keep North-South cooperation just as it was envisaged in the agreement, and we want to keep the relationship between Britain and Ireland in the same hugely close and positive place in which it's reached in the last 2 decades. But just because we all want it doesn't mean that we need a plan to make that happen. The view of the European Union and the Irish government, of course, is that we have that plan in the withdrawal agreement and the protocol in Ireland and Northern Ireland, including the backstop. And some of the members of the committee, I know, disagree with that and respectively totally understand that. But can I say, in the end of the story, we've got to ask, well, what other way forward is there? And that means that we deal with the red lines and gives us a workable plan to avoid a hard Brexit, something no one wants. The negotiations have been on 2 years, and the United Kingdom government set out their red lines at the start: leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, leave the jurisdiction of the European Union, and the freedom to do your own trade deals. So I understand that, but I think we have a complex issue to deal with, and I just hope that in the remaining weeks, and I know you have to look far beyond what my brief is on Northern Ireland, all the other issues, but I just hope we can find a solution that keeps life as close to where we are at present. Thank you, Chair.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Mr. Ahern. Can I begin by asking you about the consequences of no deal? Because, as you'll be aware, this is the subject of increasingly urgent and fevered debate here in the United Kingdom. And what would be very helpful for the committee to understand is what would be the impact of a no-deal Brexit on the Republic of Ireland?
Well, economically, there's been a number of reports done. The most recent one was the Central Bank report just about 2 weeks back. It said that it would mean a loss of about 4% of GDP very quickly. My own view is the multinational sector is probably well coped and capable of handling it, though they wouldn't like it, and nobody would. I think some of the large companies could handle it, but the indigenous sector would suffer. The indigenous agri-food sector, I think, would really suffer. It's estimated that you would lose about 40,000 jobs. In our terms, that's an awful lot of jobs. Unemployment would go up by about 2%, and the tariffs on beef and dairy in particular would be devastating. It's often, I know you can always quote figures and figures, but it's always the issue that the overall figures mightn't look too horrific. 4% is 4%, but when you look at the small indigenous, family farms, indigenous strong employer companies, it would be devastating, and there's no doubt about that. And I think it's a no deal would create huge problems. That's not to mention sterling at all. What happens with sterling could, really. I'm not into the guessing sterling. I never have been, even when I was finance minister. But that would have that could really, on top of that, have a huge effect.
Right. Now, given the law as it currently is in Britain, the only way to avoid a no-deal Brexit on the 29th of March would be to apply for an extension to the Article 50 period. What is your assessment of the likely reaction of the 27 if the United Kingdom government were to make such an application? It obviously has to be unanimous. Is your assessment that it would be granted?
Yeah, my assessment is that if I know the rules, there has to be grounds in A, B or C, but I think and obviously in a bystander, I watch closely what happens. It would be very hard and, in my view, impossible not to grant an extension. Whether that extension is short or long, but I think if the view of the United Kingdom Parliament or government or both is that time is needed for whatever reason, they wouldn't be putting up a frivolous reason. So I don't think you can say it's a frivolous reason. So I think they would be doing it on a substantive reason. Then I couldn't see why it would be rejected.
Okay, that's extremely helpful. Thank you. Pat McFadden.
Mr. Ahern, welcome. I want to go back to the Good Friday Agreement, which you were so involved in. That agreement enshrines the different identities of people in Northern Ireland. It's a very important provision whereby people in Northern Ireland can identify as British or Irish or both. And constitutionally, it means that anyone born in Northern Ireland has a right to have an Irish passport, which of course doesn't apply to people born elsewhere in the UK. How do you think Brexit affects that question of the overlapping identities built into the agreement?
Well, I think the issue is, does it change kind of person the following morning if Brexit happens on the 29th of March and on the 30th does somebody go down and they can't still say that they're Irish or British or both? And the reality is that they can. And I think the Good Friday Agreement is there. But the withdrawal agreement and the protocol, I think, in no way undermines the Good Friday Agreement. I think that's the first point to be very clear of. In fact, one of the purposes of the protocol is specifically to protect the Good Friday Agreement and the gains of the peace process. I mean, that was the whole rationale of 2 years of negotiation. And the very first article of the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland makes clear that it is, and therefore the backstop is without prejudice to the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement regarding the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, which is the question that you put. And Article 1 states that the protocol sets out arrangements necessary to address the unique circumstances on the island to maintain the necessary conditions for a continued North-South cooperation, avoid a hard border and protect the Good Friday Agreement in all its dimensions. So that precisely is what the protocol, or something like it, is designed to do. If it wasn't there, then all of these things have a difficulty, and that's the reality.
Do you think there's a danger that the debate here on the border focuses too much on issues of trade, exports, tariffs on agricultural products and so on, and perhaps ignores these questions of identity? Well,
I think it's not so much that people ignore them, but often the people who make the submissions and the big lobby groups who can afford to make the cases and issue the reports are those that are organised. But the ordinary Joe and Mary Soap are not so, and they see the border. The difficulty with the border is every past generation, present generation, and even the youngest of the generation understands the border. It was what divided our island. It was what divided our mentality. And the whole work of the Good Friday Agreement and all the efforts of people before me and before Tony Blair and me and John Major and Albert Reynolds, and was to try and see if we could bring those issues together, and if we could, in a new way, explain the complexions of Northern Ireland that have gone on literally for hundreds of years. And I certainly don't want to go back over any history in this committee other than recent history. But I think that was the whole basis of the Good Friday Agreement. And I think, in fairness to all the parties and subsequently in the St Andrews Agreement, all of the parties worked extremely diligently and hard to try to deal with that issue. Now, to answer your question, how many times during all the discussions, and I spent hundreds of hours of my life with British officials, British politicians, rarely was the discussion about trade. or tariffs, or what effect WTO might have in some time in the distant future. It was about the hearts and minds of people. It was the shared vision of how we could have a peaceful Ireland to stop the killing, the murder, the mayhem, the bombs, the everyday news of what was happening to the people of Northern Ireland, of all religions and of all sides. So, I mean, that was what it was about. It wasn't to try and create a, the island economy is important, but, in reality, I mean, the business that we do with the UK is probably, in figure terms, it's massive compared to that. So it was very much about, having peace and security, and that ordinary people could live their everyday lives. I mean, that's really what the Good Friday Agreement was about.
Thank you. I just ask you one final question on this issue of the backstop. The backstop is seen as the insurance mechanism for making sure that the border stays open. It's come under criticism from several quarters. You might hear some of it later today from some of my colleagues. From the most vocal Brexit supporting voices in Parliament, from the DUP have criticised it strongly, and Jeremy Corbyn has criticised it. He's called it a one-sided agreement and said that this is the first time in British history that we'll have entered into a treaty arrangement with anyone else in which there was no right to leave because a decision could only be made by the other side. How would you describe those common criticisms of the backstop from the most vocal Brexiteers, from the DUP and Mr Corbyn, and what's the response to them been in Ireland?
Yeah, well, two things. I mean, my simplest version of backstop, when I'm asked about it and when you get away from the 50-page protocol arrangements and everything else, I mean, the backstop plan is essentially a safety net. If there's no Brexit trade deal, it would avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. That's what it is. And also, it would ensure that there would be no tariffs, quotas, rules of origin, or custom procedures that would be applied to the UK EU deal. I mean, that's what it is. It doesn't necessarily, in my view, need 200 pages of text. But anyway, people have to do their job, and I understand that. But that's what in my view, that's the simple issue of what it means. I understand. Listen, I spent my life in politics, so I understand criticism. I understand that people take different points of view, and I always respect that. But the best brains around, and I worked with British officials when I was 20 years. I was just 21 years I spent on EU politics and the Social Affairs Council, dealing with labour, social welfare, and education. We just had one person doing the three. Then I was 3 times finance minister. I was on the ECOFIN Council, and then 3 times Prime Minister Taoiseach on the European Affairs Council. So, the officials in these areas they're bright cookies and men and women, and and if I can say so, I often use the brain power of your officials too in going through complex negotiations. And I was through 3 rounds of financial perspectives. The EU enlargement was my brief, as some of you might recall. So I was through Amsterdam and Lisbon twice in Irish cases. So, when officials spend 2 years, the combined effort, working on something, examining what's going on around the world, looking at border issues, looking at compromises, and seeing that this is the best way, and they jointly agree. Like it's definitely not one-sided. I mean, normally your numerical strength in these negotiations, and EU is very strong, and you're very experienced people, and that's not flattery. It was just fact of life. I've watched it for 20 years in your And they've said they think this is. Now, remember, and I think I'd say this to people who are opposed because I respect the views, but the EU don't particularly like it. They've said, we need alternative arrangements need to be explored. I mean, that's in the text. The Irish government have said, down the road, they can see alternatives. The British government have said that. But in my view, maybe if I was back here a few years ago, would you order the menu as we've ordered the menu with a vote, withdrawal agreement, future relationship? Well, maybe you wouldn't do it that way. But anyway, that's the way it is, and I can do nothing about that. But it seems to me that in the transition period, it must be possible to work out an arrangement and work out a way that means that the backstop isn't necessary. But that needs time. But as of now, all of the brain power said that this is what we should do.
That's very clear. Thank you very much. Stephen Timms.
Thank you very much for coming to give evidence to us. Can I ask you, is it the view in Ireland that if there was a no-deal Brexit, there would need to be infrastructure on the Northern Ireland border?
Yeah, I think it is, because people think that maybe, like where everybody says, well, the Irish government don't want it, the British government don't want it, Europe don't want it. I think most Irish people think, well, then they will definitely have it. And that's what probably what fears people, and because I can, if you wish me to go through the whole WTO rule, what could happen down the road, and what's likely to happen, and the implications for the UK of how you have to play that. And then when the objections come about WTO, what will happen from third countries? Like it might start off being a European Union UK border issue, or it might be a UK third country issue, but it'll come back. And I think most people who look at this and look at the ramifications of it believe that we would end up with it.
I mean, as you've said, both the British government and the Irish government said that they've got no intention of erecting infrastructure. But is it your assessment that the European Union would insist, at least in due course, that infrastructure was put up on the border?
Well, it depends. Would it be the EU? Would it be when it goes down the road on the WTO? Like if you look, what the issue is looked at, there's more debate and people try to follow through the logic of the WTO position. And this is what it comes down to. There are 4 or 5 brief points, Chairman. The WTO doesn't oblige the members to enforce border controls. That's the rules. However, under WTO rules, the UK is free not to apply tariffs. That's okay. But that's not a realistic option for economic and political reasons, because under WTO, most favoured nations treatment, the UK would have to give tariff-free access to all members of the WTO and not just to the European Union. And this would constitute significant leakage and a significant economic shock to the UK economy. So the UK economy, the Treasury would be all over that within months, if not weeks, in my view, and I think the view of most people in Ireland. And this would have clear political consequences, as well as the UK would lose negotiating leverage with the WTO. And it was, I think, very difficult to negotiate free trade agreements, as everybody in this committee knows, and with the EU or any other country, zero tariffs already conceded, and the UK would have no leverage. So that's not going to happen. So the UK is not going to, or the UK is not going to allow that happen. So it's in that logic that you see what would happen. So it's not the EU, it would be the consequences of the WTO.
To what extent do you think this could be resolved with checks, paperwork, various kinds of things being done away from the border and thereby avoiding infrastructure at the border?
The view on that is that it just wouldn't work. I mean, people have looked at this up and down to see if there was some technological checks that would resolve all this, and maybe someday in the future. I mean, I would never discount the ability of the software industry, which is well placed in Ireland, to come up with solutions, but it's not there today. And many people were raising this throughout the 2 years of discussions, and even early on in discussions, but no satisfactory solution came up. And it's for that reason we think ultimately you'd end up with a hard border.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sammy Wilson.
Just follow on from that last point, Mr. Ahern. First of all, you're very welcome.
Thanks.
You've identified two borders over the discussion on Brexit. The first one is the Republic of Ireland GB border. And in fact, I think you've talked about not just maintaining the common travel area, but the common trade area because of the importance of trade between Ireland and GB. Are you concerned, therefore, that just this week the EU, in its presentation on the withdrawal agreement, has stated that in the event of the UK leaving, that and it's talking about the relationship between Northern Ireland and GB, but this would equally apply to Ireland, that there would need to be checks on goods travelling between Northern Ireland and the UK at ports and airports, and those checks would be systematic. What impact would that have on your concept of the common trade area?
Well, I think in the Irish government are already looking at checks on ports and airports. That they have already started recruiting customs staff, so that in the event of Brexit or no Brexit, you could end up with additional checks. But the difficulty is, as you know, with the level of trade that goes across the border, and not just across the border, but you know the story of the sandwich sold in the west of Ireland is probably full of the contents of products that were grown in Ireland, went to the UK, and came back to make the sandwich. I mean, that's how the interrelations of the trade work. So any disruption of that, any affecting of that, and particularly if you get into any kind of tariffs and arrangements, that's going to undermine it. It's going to put on huge difficulties.
Does it surprise you that the Irish government then are so keen on a withdrawal agreement, which, as you have indicated, can be so disruptive of trade between the Irish economy and GB, and you haven't even mentioned the Irish economy and the rest of the EU, because most of your trade goes through.
Yeah, it does. It over a third. But let's be very clear about it. I mean, Brexit is disruptive, full stop. I mean, whatever way you look at the United Kingdom from an Irish point of view, and from the island of Irish point of view, north and south, it badly affects. There's very few plus sides, and I can't think of any, in the United Kingdom withdrawn from Europe. It does not help the trade between North and the UK, and it doesn't help the trade between the North and the South, and it doesn't help trade between the South and the UK. Like even with the withdrawal agreement, even with the withdrawal agreement as it is today, and I appreciate you don't like that at all, but that's creating difficulties. I mean, there's no plus in this. It's trying to, what the Irish government are trying to do is minimise that to the best of their ability.
Well, could it not be minimised by some of the solutions that you have suggested, and indeed recently Michel Barnier has suggested? I mean, you are on record as saying that technology and turning a blind eye to some of the minor cross-border trade. It could be one way round the checks. Michel Barnier, just within the last month, has said that paperless checks and decentralisation of checks could be, in fact he's talking about that as a solution in the event of a no deal. Are there not less disruptive ways of checking on trade than the withdrawal agreement, which, as you've said, would have quite dramatic effects?
Well, if there is, I'm afraid, Chairman, if there is, they haven't come up with it. Like, they have looked at this for two solid years, and they have not come up with anything better than what is in the withdrawal agreement. Is the question, if they have more time, when it becomes clear what the future relationship would be? If we were sitting here today and we knew precisely what the future relationship would be and what the trading relationship would be, would it then be easier to see that the backstop wouldn't be necessary in some other way? Probably the answer to that is yes, but that isn't where we are. And I believe that I don't have any desire to see the backstop ever implemented, and what I would rather see that in the events that we go through, it could be the end of 2020 or the end of 2022. Now, you probably wouldn't agree with the end of 2022, but whatever the date is, that it should be possible to work out in the transition period a better solution as it unfolds what the future relationship will be. But as of now, the withdrawal agreement is what's negotiated, or the protocol, the backstop is what's negotiated, and they see it as the only way of ensuring with certainty that we have a soft border. When
you had spoken about technological solutions, was that with some knowledge of what the Irish government at that stage were contemplating, and have you any idea why that has not been pursued?
I must say that I firmly believe that in the dim and distant future, there's some technological advances with major multinationals. Like, we've seen how revenue have moved in the last 20 years of being able to deal with large companies totally through technology compared to what it was a decade ago or 20 years ago. But as of now, there is not technology, and they've looked at every border situation. And Chairman, I suppose it's we might as well be clear that this, like, they looked at every situation and every border to see if there was, in any case, anywhere that it was possible to trade without there being physical infrastructure. And unfortunately and regrettably, there's none.
And that's what we as a committee also concluded from our
and that's why
investigation of arrangements.
That's why we are with the backstop, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Could I just come to one last point, and that's about relationships, because you mentioned about the Belfast Agreement and the importance that of relationships, and it was really designed to try and improve relationships both within Northern Ireland and between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. Do you think that the agreement and the objective of the agreement of reconciliation and better relationships has been helped by some of the rhetoric which has come from the current Taoiseach, when he talked about turning off the lights in Northern Ireland, stopping planes flying across the Republic, sending troops to the border, building a Berlin Wall round the border? Do you think that has helped the relationships between Northern Ireland and the Republic?
Well, you know how much I love all the parties in Northern Ireland and how much I love all the parties in the south of Ireland. So what I've spent my life doing is trying to make sure that we have a love-in of all of us. Rhetoric from anybody at any time isn't helpful.
That's a very clear answer to a very direct question. Thank you. Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Mr. Ahern, you described a few moments ago the disruptive impacts, as you see it, stemming from a hard Brexit or a no deal on trade in Northern Ireland. How disruptive, potentially, do you think Brexit is for the political and constitutional order affecting Northern Ireland?
Well, you know, I think for 20 years, the efforts of successive governments of Labour Party and Conservative Party, but working with successive governments in Ireland, I think we probably one of the principles was to get peace first and to try and I think that has worked really well and continues to work well, and hopefully in no circumstances will that change. So I think that's the first thing. It has, I think, is the last question. It is, in fairness, it has raised tensions again. It's brought back a lot of the rhetoric of the past, and it's brought back a lot of the issues of the past. And if I can, Chairman, maybe in answering that question, if I could just remind the committee of just a little bit of the history, since I was stuck in the history of it, but just the particular piece of the Good Friday Agreement, which I think is very relevant to what your question, and I think it underpins the need for a backstop or something like it. Right? I wasn't there negotiating a backstop, but I support it, or something like it. And I want to particularly mention what was Article 1.5 of the bilateral agreement between the two governments, which was what I signed with Prime Minister Blair and on Good Friday of '98. And the agreement effectively incorporated into one document all the intergovernment commitments of the multi-party talks. I won't go through all of them, but all the bits were put into one document. And it's a very short document. A lot of talk about the Good Friday Agreement, but the document that I and Tony Blair signed was only 2.5 pages, few articles. And in my view, it's a critical one, particularly in the way that it frames the formal and binding international agreement between the two governments and the careful set of compromises that were reached on the question of the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, which is what you raise. And there was one other critical provision in that, and I think people have maybe lost sight of that. And as I watch from the sidelines nowadays, I just want to bring it back and use this committee to bring it back into play. It is the deployment of the principle of parity of esteem for both communities in Northern Ireland, which was central, I think we all agreed, to what the agreement was about in terms of how sovereignty would be exercised in both cases, whether we're talking about the current dispensation of continuation of the Union or the UK in a future United Ireland. And just very briefly, it's only a few lines, what Article 1.5 says. It says the two governments affirm that whatever choice is freely exercised by a majority of the people in Northern Ireland, the power of the sovereign government with jurisdiction there shall be exercised with rigorous impartiality on behalf of all the people in the diversity of their identities and traditions, and shall be founded on the principles of full respect for equality of civil, political, social and cultural rights, the freedom from discrimination for all citizens, and the parity of esteem and of just and equal treatment for the identity, ethos and aspirations of both communities. So in other words, and in reply to your question, Chairman, and I think this is vital, the Good Friday Agreement is not a winner-takes-all scenario. In fact, it's the very opposite. Yes, the majority rule decides which overall sovereignty prevails at any given time, as between the Union with the UK or the United Ireland. But what Article 1.5 does, as another and co-equal part of the jigsaw, it describes the way the sovereignty is to be expressed, and the way the sovereignty is to be exercised or expressed is effectively through what we call parity of esteem. And I think it's fairly simple, Chairman. Either these words mean something or they don't, and if they don't, we're in effect setting aside the Good Friday Agreement. I don't think anyone is saying that. So, but if the words do mean something, then the issue that impinges on the status of Northern Ireland must pass the test of Article 1.5 and ensure that equal treatment to both communities, including the nationalist community. And this is where the argument arises. And I think if we stick to the agreement, that's where the whole issue of the backstop comes in to the language, and that's why it's there.
Do you think Brexit makes it inevitable that there will be a border poll?
Well, I think the Good Friday
depend very much on the type of Brexit, for example. No deal.
It's brought the issue back into focus, but I am strongly of the view that having a border poll in the short term, and for that matter the foreseeable future, until the institutions in Northern Ireland are properly set up again and functioning for a prolonged period, that it would be the wrong thing to do. I'm very strong on that point. I think it's what I want to see is the Brexit issue dealt with, and then the effort to re-engage the parties on all sides to get the institution back up and running. And then, as the provision in the Good Friday Agreement is there, that sometime in the future they can have a border poll. But bringing a border poll into the middle of this, in my view, is irresponsible.
You worked very closely with Senator George Mitchell, and you saw the importance of a role played by somebody outside of the immediate context of the parties involved in the discussion. Do you think that the current discussion around the backstop and all of the absence of trust that it displays would lend itself to a role being played by somebody outside of the immediate context, that there's a role for some external mediation in this?
I don't think so. It'll probably prolong it even more and maybe complicate it more. I think I think on this particular issue we have resolved the issue. I've said it many times. The Good Friday Agreement resolved the constitutional issue in Northern Ireland on the basis of consent, that Northern Ireland, as of now, remains part of the United Kingdom, and until someday that changes by the will of the people without the interference. But I think we also have to be very clear on this. And Chairman, with the greatest respect, sometimes when I hear people, including some distinguished members of Parliament, which I totally respect their views, and others talking loudly over the past few years of no basis existing for any divergence of any kind between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, I look to wondering, had I turned into Rip Van Winkle, that great man from the legend, who fell asleep for 20 years and woke up finding everything changed. And the reality is, when I changed the constitutional position of Articles 2 and 3, what that did was, I said there was a difference between Dublin and Belfast. That's what I said. But I also said that there was a difference between Belfast and Finchley. The argument that the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, is precisely the same as Finchley is incorrect. It's constitutionally incorrect as per the Good Friday Agreement, and I think people need to understand that.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you. Peter Grant.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Ahern. You mentioned earlier the idea that technology at some time in the past might be able to solve all of these problems. Is it realistic to expect that technology to be available by the 29th of March this year?
It's not going to happen. But I think what might be realistic is that during the transition period that it could be resolved. But I think I would like to see, from my perspective, I'd just like to see us move on now and that issue. But I totally accept what the view of Parliament is.
Thank you. One of the things that's been suggested as a way of dealing with the incompatibility of any kind of border checks with the Belfast Agreement is that these checks could be carried out somewhere away from the border. Now, leaving aside the very practical problem that if the checks are done 10 miles inside the border, an awful lot of stuff is going across the border and never find its way to the checks. Would customs checks or border checks situated, say, 10 miles inside Northern Ireland or 10 miles the other side of the border, would they be seen by the people of Ireland as complying with either the letter or the spirit of the Belfast agreements?
No, they wouldn't, unfortunately.
Thank you. Some of the other things that have been suggested, and some of them have gained a degree of traction within this Parliament in some quarters, that have been said would solve the problem. One is if the Republic of Ireland just unilaterally goes against the requirements of the EU treaties by not carrying out its responsibilities to maintain the border of the EU after Brexit. One is that the Republic should just leave the European Union, and that would solve all the problems. And one which I believe is currently the subject of a petition to this Parliament is that the Republic should rejoin the United Kingdom, and that would solve all the problems. What's your impression as to how these various suggestions have been received among the people of Ireland?
Well, I just be kind and say not very well. I think, you know, listen, some of the suggestions are put forward seriously, and you know, I look at those, but I think a lot of effort has been put in by a lot of people over a lot of time. And I'm not talking about myself, I'm just saying, you know, people, including people in this room, have put a lot of effort into trying to develop a new relationship. And I think the important thing, unfortunately, we've an 800-year pass of difficulties, and that's just the reality of our history. The Good Friday Agreement and all the work associated with it, and St Andrew's Agreement and other initiatives of the last 20 years have led to an extraordinarily successful Northern Ireland with very little difficulties. There are some issues of reconciliation. There's still work and ongoing work to be done. And I think I've great respect for all of the politicians of all sides in Northern Ireland. But I think what we need to do is keep building on what we've achieved and keep going forward. Now, for totally other issues outside of Brexit, we've had our problems, and you know, hopefully we can get over those. But what's complicating the progress is Brexit, and just how that affects the island of Ireland and the relationship of the Good Friday Agreement. I do think, if I can say it, back to the point I'm making earlier on, what does frustrate me and others is that there's a view that Northern Ireland is still intricately linked to the UK in a way that ignores the Good Friday Agreement. And that's the bit that really upsets us, because it's not. I mean, the parity esteem and the constitutional clauses that I said to you the question are absolutely paramount to this. If that wasn't the case, you could say that, you know, it was a different position, but it's not that position. I mean, Northern Ireland is not the same as any other part of the UK. It's just not, and that's the difficulty. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for coming. A relatively quick question. Is there cross-party support for the Irish government's handling of the negotiations, from your perspective?
It's almost totally one of the rare issues on the island of Ireland is that in the south of Ireland, all of the parties are supporting the government line. All of the business organisations and all of the agricultural organisations. So in the Republic of Ireland, there's almost total unanimity on the line.
And would you say, you know, in this country we get a degree of real frustration with politics and politicians from the population? Would you say the people of Southern Ireland are also behind the way the government is handling?
Yes, they are, because and you know, some of this is built on emotion, and because most people remember the border. They remember going and been sitting in long queues. They remember that when they had to go, and most of them didn't want to go very often because there wasn't that relationship between Dublin and Belfast, which is there now. Now young people are going up to shop, they're going up to have nights out, they go to Belfast, they love Belfast, Christmas not long gone. You know, people are back and forward, they're going up on holidays to the Giant's Causeway, which I think was the hottest place in any of these islands yesterday, 14 degrees. So, you know, people are, there's, you know, people want to exchange, and they fear that an infrastructural border equals trouble, disagreement, army, soldiers, police. Some of it might be exaggerated, but there's that fear of the slippery slope, and that is why, you know, almost, you know, even when I walked a short distance from my hotel over here this morning, I was stopped by a young man who gave me didn't say good morning to me or goodbye to me, but gave me his view on what should happen in Northern Ireland, as Northern Ireland people tend to do. They give their view. So I think it is something that really worries people. I mean, and everybody is tuned into this issue.
But wouldn't then, sorry, just one last, wouldn't then the people feel that the hardening of the tone is actually exactly making that happen? That you know, politicians are starting to talk quite tough language on either side, and aren't people worried that the Irish government itself, the hardening of the tone, will actually make exactly that happen, that they fear? Well,
in fairness, I mean, there has been some language used, and you know, by all sides, I think. But in fairness, the Prime Minister last week was in Belfast, and I think she made a really good speech, and I think it was a speech that was holding out. And Minister for Foreign Affairs, Simon Coveney, made an excellent speech in Queen's just 2 weeks back. So I think there have been, if people were referring to, I think what their considered views are, I think both those speeches I thought were excellent speeches, trying to, you know, to calm the tone and get the message right on both sides. And you know, I think it is appreciated in Ireland that your Prime Minister is working hard on this. I think there's a lot of respect that she's trying very hard, and I think there's respect that she's trying to that she is understanding the difficulties for us of a hard border on the island of Ireland, and I think that so there's not I think annoyance at what the efforts of the Prime Minister are, or the government.
Thank you very much, Richard Graham.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for joining us this morning. You can see very clearly the main issue in Parliament here is about a lack of trust in not being locked indefinitely into a backstop against our wishes. And George Mitchell has described you as a builder of bridges. From your point of view, do you see this as a bridge that could be built, if you like, relatively simply? The Polish Foreign Minister, for example, said that if Ireland asked the EU to put a time limit on the backstop, then the problem could be solved very quickly. And would you not agree that if a time limit were put on it, of course there is a problem that an insurance policy with a time limit isn't an insurance policy, but within that specified time, it shouldn't be beyond the wit of the EU and the UK to agree a future relationship that resolves this problem? What do you see as the easiest way of rebuilding that trust so that we can get over this problem?
Yeah, I do think that, you know, there's issues of trust, and I understand that there always is, and I suppose the very thing we're talking about, the Good Friday Agreement, it was an issue of trying to build trust and cement trust. But it seems to me that your Prime Minister was it Friday, and the talks that have been going on has been trying to find a way. I mean, I think the EU position is clear. The withdrawal agreement is closed, and they're not going to open up the withdrawal agreement. But what Jean-Claude Juncker's statement the other day, as President of the Commission, was saying that he was open to looking at the future relationship, or looking at ways of trying to substantiate that more early on, to try and see if there was a way of dealing with that. and to find a way of trying to deal with what is a big issue for all of you, is that it has legal guarantees. So they seem to be looking at that. If you ask me the honest question, I spent most of my life negotiating things. I don't think it's actually the greatest rocket science difference that I ever saw. But you might need the transition period to actually deal with that. But I see the difficulty. I mean, quite frankly, I see the difficulty. In the normal course of events and negotiation, you should be looking at the withdrawal agreement and the future trade relationship as one entity. But I'm afraid I'm not responsible for that.
No, indeed, and I think we'd all agree with you that it's very clear that the greatest difficulty in the process the EU rather imposed on us was the difficulty of trying to deal with Northern Ireland without knowing what the future was going to look like. But dealing with things as they are at the moment, were there to be an understanding between the EU and the UK with a legally binding annex that enabled our Attorney General to change his advice to the government, that we wouldn't be locked in indefinitely against our will, would that cause a significant issue for either the government of the Republic of Ireland or its supply and confidence partner?
I think it's not even the supply and confidence part. I think the view in Ireland collectively is that a time limit on the backstop isn't a backstop, that you just cannot do that because, as you said yourself, an insurance policy that ends on Friday and if you get sick on Saturday isn't much good of an insurance policy. So nobody is going to do that. But I think what the Irish government have said, and I think I agree with it, is that the backstop is there until there's something better negotiated. And it should be possible in time in the transition period, because remember, the backstop doesn't take effect during the transition period, so it should be possible. And I think the Irish government have committed themselves to working diligently as part of the European Union to try and find a solution during that transition period. But there is no possibility of the Irish government, I think, or the Irish people saying that the backstop can be time limited. There is no hope on that line, I'm afraid.
Do you think the Irish government would benefit from having you as the man helping to bridge the gap and find a solution?
They'd probably say, God forbid.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Craig McKinley.
Thank you very much. I just put on the table, during the referendum period, there was obviously a massive amount of discussion and media points about Britain's exit from the EU, and the arguments one side or the other. A media organisation has actually analysed those discussions, and only 2 out of the 4,000 interviews with various parties that took place actually raised any issue about the Irish border issue. Just lay that as it wasn't an issue then, and it's sort of become one. Let me just describe what happens now. You've got, and it's something close to my heart, might be close to yours as well. The Jameson's lorry goes from the south to the north, crosses a border. There's no border post or anything else. And the Bushmills lorry goes from the north to the south, across the border, no issues. Excise duties are massively different. VAT rates are very different. Corporation tax, probably licensing rules, all these differences across the border, and yet nobody stops anything because it's based on trust and technology, on all of those good things. And I'm sure on the very rare occasion that Irish Customs or Northern Ireland Customs actually does unload one of these lorries, when it's on the manifest that there's 4,250 bottles of Jameson's, there probably is 4,250 bottles of Jameson's. So this is based on self-assessment and trust, even though massive differences. So this is where, I'm a Brexiteer, obviously, I struggle to know where is the problem. Currently there are VAT returns, intra-stat returns for big traders if they go either side of the border, exactly the same VAT rules. There's reverse charge rules for smaller traders so that the VAT is accounted one side or the other. And you said in your article for the Irish Times in November 17 that technology and perhaps a bit of a blind eye is the way forwards. Now, I'm sure, and maybe you can confirm this, do you think, even currently, with all these VAT rules, and they're very strict, required by the EU, that there is full compliance with every Intrastat return, every VAT return for this little bit of cross-border trade? Or is it just something that happens, something that will always happen, and shouldn't we just get on with it as a way forwards for now?
Well, I think with the few things on that, I mean, I still stand over the comment that there is the unofficial economy that will always be switching a certain amount of goods, particularly probably in small suppliers who are working across border, but they're a very small percentage of the overall trade. I think if somebody calculated, it's probably, well, there's a good bit of it. It's probably 97% is the formal economy, so it's very large. So I think it's that 97% is the difficulty, but it's the very complexity. I mean, this is what happened in the discussions for the last few years. It's the very complexity of what happens in the border. You have every day with the whisky, but you have it in agriculture even more so. You have people driving up, processing the product, driving down, and that's all because we're all in the European Union, and we're all on the same regime, and we're all covered by the same directives, and those directives, as you and I know, are massively complex, but they're detailed, they're thought through, and the day, and this is the problem, the day that the UK are no longer subjected to any of those in Northern Ireland, if that was the way it was, and we are in the south because we're still in the single market, there comes the problem. So, the picture you well painted of how the rosy tree is exactly the reason you need a backstop, to keep it the way you painted it. So I'm afraid, even as a good Brexiteer, you've made the argument very well for the backstop.
Now, you described the Good Friday Agreement, which has been aired massively. Wasn't aired, obviously, during the referendum campaign, 2 out of 4,000 media pieces, but now it is. Now, you described it's 2.5 pages of preamble. I think it amounts to another 50 pages. And that was a very powerful document that laid a change to the way things are done and all the good things that flowed from that. But we're now faced with 585 pages for something that is being made complex, but that perhaps shouldn't be so. Why is it that you describe Northern Ireland as different from Finchley? I'm not sure I entirely agree with that, but the EU has allowed Spain and the UK to talk bilaterally about Gibraltar in the future, quite happily within this arrangement. I mean, Gibraltar is a different place. It's within the single market, not in the customs union. Why don't you think it would be a sensible way forwards for the EU to say, Britain, UK and the Republic, do your own bilaterals based on, and this is the key that has broken down everything, is because the EU will not accept mutual recognition. Does the EU really think that suddenly overnight the UK is going to be importing, Chinese toys with lead paint on them? It's a nonsense. It's not going to happen. We need mutual recognition. I think this could be the thing that would break the impasse for the future.
No, and I take the point, but I mean, you know the answer to the question yourself. The rules are that and particularly once Article 50 was triggered, I think I've said in the past, and I think maybe in that same interview that you quoted, I think I said that there should have been bilateral discussions prior to Article 50 being triggered, but I do accept the position once it was triggered, then it was a different situation. I mean, I think a lot of mistakes were made during that period by all sides, maybe from the period.
Unfortunately, we have to use that phrase, we are where we are.
We are where we
Yes.
are. But now we are where we are, and the negotiations are handled, collectively for everybody by the negotiators and Barnier's group, and of course Ireland are feeding in all the time into that. But there's no way around that.
I mean, I find it very surprising, and when we have to accept, as the days tick down, whatever we are, 44, 45 days now, that the chance of no deal is increasing by the day. And I'm very surprised that there isn't a fear factor creeping into the Republic with all those losses of jobs, 40,000, 4% reduction in the overall GDP. I'm surprised that isn't being addressed, or the people of the Republic aren't saying, come on, government, you're not actually reflecting our views here, and get on with something different. Have the flexibility that the UK is looking for, and we can get a deal over the line. I'm really surprised.
Yeah, well, I think, and I can just give you my view on that. I think there still is a hope that where the EU have stated their position, Parliament here has stated your position clearly, that in the discussions that took place last week between the Brexit Secretary, between the Prime Minister, between Barnier, between Juncker, that they will make some progress. I think people still believe that that's the case. It's not unusual. I lost more sleep over more nights in my European Union days negotiating the last days. It's always the way it is. But I have to tell you, the stakes are, and you don't have to tell you, the stakes are high on this. If they don't, I don't see the European Union changing on the withdrawal agreement. I just don't see that. I don't see them changing on the backstop. I don't think the Irish government are going to change on that. I think the hope is that in the ground, that on the future relationship, what can be done in that area to look at the language and to see what can be brought forward, what can be strengthened. It seems to be in that area, and I don't think you have to be an expert to see that's where they're all indicating to.
Just very finally, I mean, the hit
very quickly.
The hit on potentially, if you believe the fear factor, on a no deal on the UK would seem to be a lot smaller than the potential hit on the Republic economy, and I'm not hearing that fear from the Republican or from the Republic politicians.
No,
I'm really surprised.
Well, I've given you the central bank. I would quote as probably being the best, and it is a big it is a big factor. But I think the idea of, if you were to ask 1,000 Irish people, can they conceive any arrangement where they would go back to being a hard border, I'm afraid that will take precedence.
Thank you.
That's very clear. Thank you. Hal Williams.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. I'd like to ask you two brief questions, one on trade and one on identity and citizenship. The first one on trade, and the committee won't be surprised to hear that I'm particularly interested in the trade between Holyhead and Dublin, because there's been a great deal of tension between from the north-south trade and the channel trade. I heard the other day that, for example, 40% of fresh food exports from the north actually go through the Republic to Holyhead. There's a huge implication there if there's no deal. And what has had very much less attention than I think it deserves is the trade from the UK, from GB, through Holyhead to the Republic. It always seems to be framed in the difficulties that Ireland might face, but this is very significant for us. So do you think there's been sufficient attention to that east-west, west-east trade, particularly in respect of the dangers of no deal?
Yeah, I think this is it's an enormous issue, and our relevant industries, those that represent the export sector and the import sector, because the two-way trade, as you know, is enormous. They, in fairness to them, have been focusing on this from the start to see, and there is huge concern about how that will operate, and we just have to you just have to wait to see. But I mean, you know yourself, you've probably seen some of the reports that have been done, the delays, the bureaucracy, the cost to business, you know, the difficulties for perishable goods. The list is endless, and it's of huge concern. But they have, in fairness to the people involved, they have worked, and I've heard them on the media. They've worked long and hard at seeing how they can handle this. I mean, they're still going to have to use the route. There are some suggestions of trying to do alternative dishes, but none of those are going to happen overnight. So these are real issues.
Can I just ask you about citizenship? And this is a bit tangential, really, but in your wide experience within the European Union, thinking of that, are we looking sufficiently at experiences within the European Union in other border areas? And the example that comes to mind for me is the situation in Estonia, where there are 300,000 Russian citizens living in Estonia, and there are 300,000 people in the north, of course, who have Irish passports. I mean, it's not analogous, but there are issues there around citizenship, around transports and travel, and of interest to me around language issues as well. Now, are we looking broadly enough, or have we in the past, and is there anything further that we can learn from European experiences elsewhere?
Well, I think thankfully the common travel area, we don't have a difficulty on the island of Ireland with the movement of people, but I think we can see throughout Europe, more generally, leaving Ireland out of it, we can see more generally the difficulties that are happening, and I think will continue to happen with immigrants from outside the European Union, and because of there are several countries have either revamped or changed their legislative basis for handling immigration and handling border controls, and I think that's just going to get more complex as time goes on, as we have people moving around the world, and I think that's just getting that's just going to get more complex. In the Estonia, I visited Estonia many times. In fairness, you probably know far more than I do, but I know that there is considerable tension all the time with our border controls and even internally on that issue. And it is always an issue that's very at the top of the government agenda, which I think you're probably more familiar with than I am.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Ahern. It's a pleasure to see you. I have in my office at home a copy signed by you and Mr. Blair of the agreement, just to remind me how important that is. Could I ask you, you've referred already to the vast improvement in relations between the Republic of Ireland and the UK over the last couple of decades, and you've played a major role in that. How, given this very difficult period that we're going through at the moment, how do you see that we can continue to maintain that, both formally and informally? What should we be doing as the Parliament of the UK, and indeed in the UK as a whole?
I think there is no doubt about it. The relationships have really strengthened. I had the honour a little over a decade ago now, of being able to speak. I think the only Irish teacher that ever spoke to the joint houses here, and on that day I was talking about how we had moved from a position of a lack of understanding for each other to great harmony and building the future relationship, and I think that has continued. I mean, there is a huge closeness. I mean, there's practically every Irish family has somebody living here, or there's connections here. There's people support the sports here. Most people support Premiership clubs here or Championship clubs here. There's the connections through rugby and all the other angling, and so all these relationships have built up over the years, and I think we have to keep on working. My own view is that in all the years that I spent on the European Council, and for the last 45 years, and I think there is a role that we can all play in trying to help this. I built up my knowledge of the UK system, the UK ministers, the political system, meeting parliamentarians, meeting committees, meeting the officials, was through the European Union. And all our officials, particularly the people on technical working groups, were meeting all the time, and they build up relationship. And there's contact all the time between them. Some sanctions, lots not sanctioned, but relationships are built up. And the Irish and the English mix after the meetings, and I've seen that and been part of it for all the years. The withdrawal, leaving the European Union for the UK, which I respect your decision to people, and that ends that in one go. All that connection and all that relationship and political, and I've dealt with so many ministers and different portfolios and prime ministers. That was enormous. It was enormous benefit, I think, for both of us and understanding. But it's gone the day you leave, whether it's 29th of March or some other day. And I think we have to now find something else. Now, I think the something else is the relationship that is what's in the Good Friday Agreement, the British-Irish Council, the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference. And I think the governments should continue to meet. Maybe every twice a year the Prime Minister and the Taoiseach could meet. Maybe every quarter the economic ministers could meet. Maybe every other quarter the social ministers could meet. But I think there needs to be, like that has been there for 45 years. That wasn't the Good Friday Agreement, but that's dead as of now. So I think and I don't think we need a new way of doing it. I think we just need to slightly expand and develop what's under the Good Friday Agreement, and hopefully if the institutions, it is my view that if it wasn't for Brexit, that the institutions in Northern Ireland would have been up and running a year ago. I think unfortunately Brexit has stopped that. It wasn't the reason it brought it down, it had nothing to do with it, but I think it's the reason that it's not back up. And I think that is a shame that those institutions aren't there. United Kingdom are not responsible for any of that, but I think Brexit is, and by relationship that's created the difficult. But I think we need to get that back. But it should not be underestimated in talking about the relationship what leaving the EU will do to the everyday contact between our administrations and our political systems. I'm afraid that ends, and that's an awful pity.
Thank you.
Okay. And finally, before I wrap up, Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks, Mr. Ahern, for your fascinating evidence. I just wanted, I think, to ask a more, if you like, strategic or philosophical question, if you like, about the future of the European Union. Given your vast experience in the EU and the many, many European Council meetings that you've attended, and your insights about the role that the EU plays, both in terms of fostering bilateral relationships and multilateral relationships within the EU and indeed globally. Do you think that there is in any way an opportunity with Brexit for it to be a reset moment, not just for the United Kingdom, but also a reset moment for the European Union? As you'll know, President Macron and others have talked about a multi-tier European Union, and perhaps this idea that the kind of one-size-fits-all top-down approach to integration hasn't always worked for all member states. And if we were to pursue a path on Brexit, which in essence made the United Kingdom into a country that has a very close, if you like, market-based relationship with the European Union, frictionless trade, something along the lines of the European Economic Area, plus a form of customs union, but we're not in the political institutions, if you like, one step removed then from the deeper political project, if you like. Do you think that could be the beginning of a new way of Europe and the European project working, and that you could move towards this sort of multi-tier Europe, perhaps with some of the Central and Eastern European countries, the Nordics, with the United Kingdom, and it would be a kind of a geo-strategic shift. Do you think that Brexit could potentially present an opportunity in that sense? And what's your sense, based on your insights and experience in the EU, of what you think the appetite for that multi-tier, multi-speed Europe could be?
Yeah, the concept, there's a number of things in that. I just try to be brief. The idea of the multi-tiered Europe is not a new one. It's been around for a quarter of a century. Two-tiered Europe, as they used to call it. The French and German were looking at this back in the 80s and the 90s. I think if it had been a few years ago, I would have answered your question by saying multilateralism is the right way of dealing with things and going forward. But with the advent of anti-multilateralists like President Trump and others, the world has changed, and I think it will evolve. I think the EU will continue to evolve. Personally, I would have liked to seen it evolve with the United Kingdom being a member. Because I think it would have, like the changes that I've seen in the years I was in the Council, the Single European Act, which was your achievement, made a huge difference. It made a huge difference to trade and to business for the island of Ireland. The changes in the Economic and Monetary Union and how that evolved, you're at the very heart of all of those decisions. So I think Europe will continue to evolve, and there will be changes, in leadership. I think maybe the vision isn't as clear now as it would have been maybe when President Delors was outlining his kind of vision, whenever it was, 25 years ago. But with the UK out, I'm not too sure how that'll evolve, but from an Irish perspective, we're going to stay in. There's huge support, nearly 90%, 87% support in the single market. But can I say, as we come to the end, our interest is being as close as possible to the UK. We want to have as harmonious a relationship as we can, not just to do with trade and business, but to do with